Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 5 from the Prodigy, Invaders Must Die. Alright, we finally made it to the last Prodigy album that I haven't already done a video on, and this one's gonna be pretty simple to get through, I think. Coming off the heels of their last album, Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned, performing less well than the fat of the land, the band finally saw themselves get dropped from the label that had been hosting them from the start, XL Recordings, and going independent, forming an imprint called Take Me to the Hospital, as a subsidiary of the Cooking Vinyl label. Now, for any other band, one might think that this might be putting them in trouble of finally losing the commercial success they'd been maintaining for so long. But I'm not sure anything's capable of really killing off the Prodigy's commercial success. Always Outnumbered may have been critically panned, but it still sold really well and has loads of fans and defenders standing behind it as properly great, including, like, some of their contemporaries in the industry, like the band Justice, for instance. I may personally be more on the critic side with that album, but it was clear their career was never going to be in danger. Still, perhaps the somewhat more mixed reception had Liam Howlett thinking it might be time to course correct a bit and go back to the basics of what made the Prodigy so popular in the first place. And so eventually we made it to 2009 with this 5th album, Invaders Must Die. As usual, sold like gangbusters, went to number 1 in the UK. In fact, it sold even better than Always Outnumbered. A successful course correction it was indeed, despite no longer being backed by a semi-major label. And I think part of the key to making sure this album performed as well as it did was the fact that there was a new little electronic scene starting to make headway in the mainstream around the time that they could start marketing themselves to. And that, of course, was the EDM and dubstep scenes. Now, this album didn't necessarily start their appeal to that scene. Before they broke off from XL Recordings, a little drum and bass band called Pendulum that was popular with the young folk at the time were brought on to remix their classic Voodoo People single in 2005 as a tie-in with the Prodigy's 15th anniversary greatest hits comp, beginning a pretty healthy relationship that would continue forwards in later years as Liam Howlett would return the favor by showing up on that band's 2010 album Immersion to co-produce the track Immunize, almost as if to christen that band as the Prodigy's natural successor, which maybe wouldn't entirely pan out given Pendulum stopped releasing things and instead pivoted to the Knife Party side project almost immediately after that. But I still feel like that association in particular ensured that the Prodigy would maintain a solid audience with the younger EDM crowd. As did other cosigns from other burgeoning EDM adjacent outfits who were brought in for remixes of this album, such as Noisia, Sub Focus, and Rusko, among others. The Prodigy may not have been doing the same numbers or pushing the same level of influence on the scene as they were at the end of the 90s, but they hadn't lost any of their popular relevance. Now, as well as Invaders Must Die performed commercially, it was not a turnaround for the band critically. It still got met with the exact same mixed reviews that Always Outnumbered were met with. This time with the primary criticism across the board boiling down to, they're just doing the exact same shit you'd expect from them, and aren't doing anything creative or boundary pushing like they used to. I mean, people did also say that about Always Outnumbered at the time, and I don't think that was really true of that album, but I do think that observation is accurate in the case of this album. Like, it may have been marketed to appeal to the burgeoning EDM crowd, but the actual sounds they were exploring here didn't actually include any dubstep or flashy EDM anthems that would have been mistaken for any other artists who were popular at the time. No proto-Skrillex-style bass wubs to be found here. It's kinda just a rehash of what worked on earlier albums of theirs, such as The Fat of the Land, and that's about it. Just more of the breakbeat sound you'd expect from them, albeit this time with a more polished mastering job so as to not feel outright out of place on that scene. There's definitely an argument to be made of this album basically being the point at which Liam Howlett officially stopped giving a shit about the music he was putting out, and the direction the band would go in afterwards with albums like The Day Is My Enemy and No Tourists lends even further credence to that theory. I may have already given a particularly favorable review to The Day Is My Enemy and gone on that record as saying that album is even better than this one, but that's not really because of Howlett's contributions to that album. Not only was the production on their actual dog shit with every track inexcusably compressed to death, half of that project he was just phoning in the exact same beat over and over, only to get his ass saved by Maxim and Flint delivering their absolute A-game in their hook writing. That album would not work even close to as well as it did if Howlett had tried to handle the whole thing on his own and the other two guys hadn't been there. So yeah, I hear an album like this, which does not have the same A-plus easily memorable hooks that The Day Is My Enemy has, and yeah, I totally get where this album's detractors come from. The people who complained about the lack of innovation, they're not wrong. The question of how that impacts enjoyment, of course, comes down to whether or not you consider that lack of innovation to actively get in the way. I say so long as the formula is still being done well, then I don't see any crime in a rehash like this. And at least for me, Invaders Must Die is a solid bounce back from my personal disappointment in Always Outnumbered. Not only does going the safe route mean that this album lacks the number of more baffling choices made in the direction of Always Outnumbered, but it also shares that album's greatest strength in the actual production and mixing and mastering, which, when applied to these more palatable ideas, I suppose, translates to this being what I personally believe to be the best engineered Prodigy album. Now, in years previous, I also may have just left this album off as, being kind of forgettable, which is still kind of true. This album is not the most easily catchy collection of tracks they've ever delivered, but the production saves it for me. The bass is really heavy and satisfying, all the percussion hits with lots of solid impact, and the treble on top is still really clean and clear sounding. Just the right amount of compression for the mixes to feel big and imposing without squashing any of them into oblivion. All these mixes feel perfectly well balanced for what they're going for. I mean, I suppose people can disagree with me on this. I've noticed a particular tendency for many a fan of 90s bands to just shit on production styles from the 2010s EDM scene as a blanket knee-jerk reaction to how unsubtle and commercial the music coming out of that scene often was. But just because it sounds like a product of that particular time and isn't musically subtle doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of subtle craft and hard work put into actually getting this stuff to sound good. I may personally prefer The Day Is My Enemy over this, thanks to all the individual songs on that one being astronomically catchier. The fact that that album works at all, let alone as well as it does, is impressive in its own right. But that album can be an actively exhausting listen to get through, where this one's a much breezier experience. If nothing else, the sound engineers behind this one were picking up a lot of the slack, so shoutouts to Neil McClellan, Damian Taylor, and John Davis for their work here. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's talk about individual tracks. There's not really a lot to say about any of these tracks, but they all bang and sound good, which is, I guess, kind of all that matters for an album like this. Though there are definitely some that work for me more than others. The album gets off to a really strong start with the first handful of tracks. The title track is a bright and flashy opener with blaring leads that vaguely remind me of pendulum tracks like Slam, but being filtered through the usual Prodigy breakbeat arrangement, with heavy guitars and electronic drums and stuff. And Omen rearranges all the same elements in a new, distinct way with Flint and Maxim delivering a decent hook over it. It's an omen, it won't go away. The reprise of the track later on, featuring all these brighter synth chords and less intense beatwork, is a nice addition as well. Also quite like Thunder, taking some more reggae influence, including probably the catchiest hook out of any track here, delivered by guest vocalist Brother Culture, interpolating a 70s reggae tune by Al Tashith Joe. I hear thunder, but there's no rain. Good shit. There are a number of other tracks here that also base themselves almost entirely around obvious samples, but none of them get so thuddingly obvious and on the nose as the way Howlett tried to sample Thriller on the previous album. Warrior's Dance, for instance, builds itself around a sample of Take Me Away by True Faith, Final Cut, and Bridget Grace, just slightly chipmunking this old classic house tune. I definitely did a double take when I first looked through the credits on this album and saw Jeff Mills, of all people, was credited as a co-writer, but he's just one of the writers of the song Howlett sampled. I think he's one half of Final Cut. But that sample isn't really the hook of the song so much as it is that whole part with that intense buzzing bass going over a standard 90s breakbeat. That's a bass drop clearly meant to grab your attention more than any sample would. So yeah, I fuck with that too. But as far as obvious samples go, the much more obvious case is the album's closer, Stand Up, which just bases itself around a horn sample from a Manfred Mann track called One Way Glass. I mean, in one breath, Howlett really doesn't do much with the sample. He just plays it completely straight, just in the same way he did on Phoenix and the way it is on the last album. But even if this one doesn't go any deeper than those, I think this is a lot more excusable, since if you listen to the original Manfred Mann track, I mean, that track is already practically begging to be used in a hip-hop beat. That horn section just has that sound to it that's like a perfect fit for some bombastic boom-bap joint from the 90s, and if it was never used in the way that it was on a track like Stand Up, then it would feel like the universe missed a trick. Also, this version punches it up a bit more by adding in some live drums, care of Dave Grohl of all people. Feels really heavy and satisfying, and honestly makes for the perfect ending to this album. Oh yeah, and Dave Grohl also makes a much more noticeable appearance on this album on the track Run Like the Wolves. Just him on the drums, jamming out with Flint, doing his usual yelling hook, and there's some intense blocks of bass to go alongside them. It's another highlight in terms of tracks that just go particularly hard. But also in terms of highlights, that's about it. All the other tracks on the album, again, they go predictably hard as anything else here, but they don't do enough to set themselves apart. Piranha's another track that's kind of meant to sound like Firestarter, and it's fun, but not one that really sticks out to me that much. World's on Fire kind of reminds me of their Fuel My Fire cover on The Fat of the Land. It's true that they had a whole live album named after this one, but if not for that fact, it also wouldn't have stood out to me that much. Neither would tracks like Colors or Take Me to the Hospital. Again, they go decently hard at the moment, just as any Prodigy track would, but completely disappear from my head the instant they're over and don't really deliver any distinct idea that might help me pick it out from a crowd of similar Prodigy tracks. I feel like I'm supposed to like them more than I am, but they just kind of blend into the background. Oh yeah, and there's also 2 bonus tracks included on the album on streaming services. You got The Big Gun Down and Wild West. Both are fun. The former samples Ennio Morricone, but between the two I definitely prefer Wild West. There's some solid rollicking techno and disco grooves behind that one going up next to the distorted guitars in a fun way. But yeah, that's all there is to break down on Invaders Must Die. It's a pretty shallow album. I suppose I get why some critics weren't fans, and I don't think it's the best work they've ever done. But I also don't see how one could get mad at any of this either. It's all just a brainless fun time. Is this album phoned in? Possibly. But it's not so phoned in where either the EDM-loving crowd at the time or regular fans of Fat of the Land couldn't easily get into it then or still get into it now. I saw one professional review lament the fact that there was absolutely nothing shocking about this project in the way that the Smack My Bitch Up controversy was at the time, but I frankly don't see how there's anything wrong with that. The shock value of the Fat of the Land is probably the aspect of that album that aged the worst, and an album like this kind of just confirms that they didn't need any of that in order to deliver a fun time. Now, is this album essential listening? Also, no. This is not a great or exemplary album. Absolutely nothing here was going to set the world on fire, not even the track called World's on Fire. Sure, this came out before Skrillex broke out and the EDM revolution of the 2010s really kicked into high gear in a much bigger and more widespread way. But it's also not like they created the audience for this kind of thing overnight. They just saw where the train was headed and decided to jump on before everyone else in the mainstream took notice. Hell, Always Outnumbered was probably more forward-thinking than this, with some of its experiments that actually came closer to the era of dubstep that would follow in the next decade. But, again, I mean, all of this is just to say, at the end of the day, Invaders Must Die is just a good album and that's it. Not a great one, not a bad one, not their best work, not their worst work. It's just good. It's just solidly good. And that's it. As such, I'm feeling a 7.5. out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.